Halloween is finally upon us. Parents are buying candy for the trick-or-treaters, kids are buying costumes of their favorite monsters and pop culture characters, and people are watching their favorite horror movies of all time. Even I think it's a great holiday. I think it's one of my favorite holidays of all time for me to watch some of my favorite horror movies. Like I would watch movies like The Shining, or Silence of the Lambs, or Scream, or Insidious, or Trick or Treat, or any of the Evil Dead trilogy, and I will probably talk about those in the future one day. All of those films are great, but here's a curious question. Have you ever seen a horror film that you loved but noticed that it's not getting a lot of the attention that it deserves? If you're a horror fan, then you probably had that feeling before, and even I had that kind of feeling before, and I've seen a lot of horror films that don't get a lot of credit and I think do need more credit, and that's what this top 10 list is for. It's going to be going through all the movies that are either underrated, overlooked, hidden gems, or didn't do well at the box office or with audiences. Now, I do have a few honorable mentions. These are movies that I do love. I think they're really good horror films, but sadly didn't make it on the list. Oculus, a horror movie about a brother and sister trying to kill a supernatural mirror. It makes more sense when you watch the film. A Cure for Wellness, a very weird and creepy movie with really good imagery and really good cinematography and a really good score. Ouija, Origin of Evil, a prequel to a very terrible horror film that ended up being leaps and bounds better with interesting characters and a pretty terrifying little girl. The Exorcist 3, the most underrated Exorcist film in the franchise, with really good characters, a fun performance from Brad Dourif as the main villain, and one of the best jump scares in movie history. In the Mouth of Madness, a very trippy John Carpenter film with a good performance from Sam Neill and really good practical effects and a really good production design. And Lake Mungo, a very disturbing mockumentary about a little girl gone missing. All of those films are great, and I do strongly recommend watching them. It's just that the next 10 I'm gonna mention are even better. Number 10. This is gonna be an interesting start for this list. You wanna know why? Because the first one on this list is a Disney film, and Disney is not really known for making that many dark stuff, at least in today's time, but this one came out in the 80s, and it was back when Disney didn't even give a crap about scaring kids with their films, and the best example of that is Something Wicked This Way Comes. And it is about two kids that find out about a new carnival that just came to their hometown, and they find out that this new carnival is very twisted and evil and kind of messed up, and they have to figure out a way to stop all of this from happening to everyone in their hometown. It's based off of the book by Ray Bradbury of the same name, who also wrote the script for the film. This is definitely something that you don't see in Disney movies nowadays, because in today's Disney films, they would just play it safe and not show like any of the dark stuff that they would potentially have for their films and just be worried about scaring kids with what they could do. This film, however, does not play it safe at all. It definitely goes for the dark moments. This came out in a time when Disney was still comfortable doing their dark stuff. Like, the Pinocchio film from the 40s is still a really good movie, but it's also very dark and kind of messed up, like with the Pleasure Island scenes and the kids turning into donkeys. And since we're talking about Disney from the 80s, Return to Oz from the 80s was also very dark with the Wheelers and Princess Mombi and her heads. Now when the carnies are first introduced in this small town and the kids are starting to see it, you get the feeling that something's wrong, something doesn't feel right, and once you learn more about this new carnival, it becomes a very dark and twisted carnival where they do some dark magic and some terrible things to some people. And at one point, there's a scene where the kids are fighting off a bunch of tarantulas in a room, and a kid gets decapitated in this movie. Seriously. I'm not making that up. That's actually in this movie. And a lot of that is done by the main villain of the film, Mr. Dark, played by Jonathan Pryce. He's very conniving and sinister as this main villain who does his dark magic, and Jonathan Pryce gives a fantastic performance. It's also a really good movie with an engaging story, characters that feel down to earth, a very chilling score by James Horner, and it's very freaky, and I strongly recommend watching this movie if you haven't. For me, it's the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom of Disney movies. If you haven't seen this film, I strongly recommend it, although it's not on Disney Plus, probably because Disney does not want kids to know they did a horror movie at one point. But you can still find it around Amazon for either the DVD or the Blu-ray, so at least there's still that. Number 9. Coming in at number 9 is Under the Skin, an A24 film that stars Scarlett Johansson as an alien that disguises herself as a human and drives around in a van in Scotland and seduces men to come to her hideout where she lures them in and leads them to their demise. This is one of A24's earlier films before they did movies like Hereditary and Everything Everywhere All at Once, and for me, I think this is one of their best films, because it does the show don't tell thing quite often, where we mostly see Scarlett Johansson not only seduce men and lure them to her hideout, but we also see her go out and learn more about life and what it's like for humans, and there's not a lot of dialogue, you just really see her learn about humans through her facial expressions and her body movement. It's also very creepy at times when you see Johansson just walking backwards and men just following her while they slowly sink down into this black liquid. And without giving anything away, we see more of what happens after men fall down into this liquid, which is very disturbing and very confusing. And I think that's a good thing because it gives you questions of what you saw and what it's supposed to mean for the movie. Another thing that makes this film creepy is its soundtrack by Micah Levy. It gives you a very uneasy feeling of what Johansson would do to these men, and I think it's one of the best horror scores I've ever heard. And according to IMDb, this is Micah Levy's first film composing, and I thought she did an excellent job with the score. Under the Skin is a very weird and different movie, and it's very creepy, and I do recommend watching it if you are interested in it. It has really good directing, beautiful cinematography, a creepy and chilling score, and ScarJo is really good in the movie. Also, just as a heads up, this movie has a lot of nudity, so if you're not very comfortable seeing nudity in a movie like this, then you don't have to worry about watching this film. But if nudity doesn't really bother you, then you should be fine watching this film. I mean, you get to see ScarJo naked, which that is a major spoiler. Number 8. Number 8 is Sleepy Hollow, directed by Tim Burton, and it stars Johnny Depp as Ichabod Crane, who goes to Sleepy Hollow and investigate murders of people that are missing their heads. This is Depp's third collaboration with Burton after movies like Edward Scissorhands and Ed Wood, and I think this is a very fun movie, because it shows quite a bit of the dark mythology of the Headless Horseman and the town of Sleepy Hollow itself, and you get to see Ichabod's bond with Katrina, played by Christina Ricci, grow. You also get to learn about Ichabod Crane and his past, and you get to see why he's so frantic all the time and how he became an investigator, and I thought Johnny Depp was really good as the character. And it's one of the only Tim Burton films where he doesn't wear white face paint, he just looks like a normal person, even though he does faint a couple of times whenever he sees something horrific. The production design is also really good. The town of Sleepy Hollow looks like it's been through a lot of dark stuff because of the Headless Horseman, which also, again, no spoilers, you do also get to learn more about who the Headless Horseman was in the past. If you're a fan of Tim Burton and you want to see a dark version of the Sleepy Hollow story, then give this film a watch. I think it is a really good Tim Burton film, and I think it's one of his more underrated films. Number 7. Coming in at number 7 is kind of a recent film. It came out in 2021, but the reason I still wanted to put this film on this list because I actually think this is a really good horror movie that sadly didn't do well at the box office and it didn't get a lot of credit, but I do think it really deserves that credit. And what I'm talking about is Last Night in Soho, directed by Edgar Wright. That's right, when it comes to Edgar Wright, after directing movies like Scott Pilgrim, Baby Driver, and the Cornetto trilogy, you already expect this movie to be amazing. And it is about a girl named Eloise, played by Thomasin McKenzie, who dreams of being a fashion designer and loves 60s type of stuff like 60s clothing, music, and movies. And when she moves into this small flat in London, she falls asleep there. She wakes up in the 60s and finds Sandy, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, and learns more about the 60s and realizes that it's not as good as she hoped it was gonna be. And it also relates to ghosts in a few ways. Edgar Wright is one of my favorite directors of all time. I love Scott Pilgrim and Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End, and Baby Driver, and I really liked this movie when it first came out, but it sadly didn't do well and not a lot of people saw it, and that's partly because this movie came out during COVID time and not a lot of people were comfortable about going back to the theaters back then. This is also Edgar Wright's first serious horror film, because with movies like Shaun of the Dead, that one's more of a horror comedy. Not this film, though. It's a movie that never really drags for me because it focuses on Eloise learning more about Sandy, which does get her interested at first, but when she starts learning more about what the 60s were like, she starts to realize that was a pretty horrible time for women, especially with Sandy. With Sandy, she dreams of being both an actress and a singer, but she gets herself stuck in a pretty terrible situation where she is forced to use both her looks and her body for money, and that is a pretty bad thing to do. And once Eloise starts to see all of that, she then starts to see the horror of the 80s and the ghosts of all the men that she was forced to sleep with. And she tries to figure out how to stop it from happening by learning more about Sandy and the men that she was with at that time. Last Night in Soho is a very good horror movie that is well directed and well acted, well edited as well, and it has a really good soundtrack. I strongly recommend watching Last Night in Soho if you haven't yet. Number 6. The Exorcism of Emily Rose is both a horror movie and a courtroom drama about a lawyer played by Laura Linney who has to help this former priest prove his innocence after he failed to help this girl who was possessed by a demon, and people think that he might have killed her, and Laura Linney has to figure out the truth to see if this priest is actually innocent or not. This film is directed by Scott Derrickson, who later did movies like Sinister, Doctor Strange, and The Black Phone. This is one of his earlier films, and I think it is a damn good one. You get flashbacks of this girl, Emily Rose, and you see how she gets possessed by a demon, and you see the priest go to her family, and you get to see how he failed to try to save her. Also, fun fact, the actress that plays Emily Rose is Jennifer Carpenter, who is best known as Deborah Morgan. That's actually a pretty cool thing to know if you watch Dexter. And Jennifer Carpenter is really terrifying in this movie. She is really that good. The way she talks and the way she moves her body around really makes it feel convincing that there is a monster inside her. And it keeps you interested in learning more about this story, while we also see Laura Linney kind of witness demons even though she never really sees them, except for her noticing like a burning smell a few times. This is a very dark and interesting movie that gets you want to know if the priest was innocent or not, and those flashback scenes are very horrifying and very disturbing. If you like movies that relate to demons and exorcisms, then give this movie a watch. It's definitely a really good one.